Be sure to let Elaine in or tell them to let her in.
And is Michelle able to?
Yeah, she's the guy. She's the co-host. Well, she is kind of the guide, I suppose, the online guide. All right.
You want me to just be here?
If you let me come over there, because I'll call you up. All right. Well, welcome. We are an intimate crowd tonight. There's several folks online, and there might be a couple more folks joining us. I want to welcome everybody who's here, and also folks who are online, whether you're online live with us now, or you're going to be watching later on. We want you to know that you're welcome to our time tonight. Let me say a brief prayer, and then I'll kind of introduce our forum and our speaker tonight. All right, so let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the grace that you give to us to be reflective human beings who live in community with one another and with you. We ask and pray that tonight, as we're challenged to think more carefully and critically, that we are able to take some of what's going to be shared with us tonight into our own lives and let it affect us in positive ways, to the glory of your name and to the love and goodness towards our neighbors. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So tonight is, this is our second Faith and Forum for this program year. And the Faith and Forums are designed around the idea that faith is not something that we leave at the door when we leave the church, right? It's something that intersects with the whole of our life. It has something to say to the whole of our life. And in the past, last year, we oftentimes modulated between faith and justice and faith and humanities. And so tonight is kind of a faith and humanities sort of focus. And the vision for the Faith and Humanities Forum is the idea that there are other modes or ways of knowing the world, and that those can also be conduits of truth, and that the humanistic disciplines, which actually in many ways were cultivated in the church and the history of the church, have much to teach us about what it means to live faithful lives in the world. So with that, we invite in speakers. Sometimes they'll be live, as Mark will be tonight. Other times they'll be here via Zoom. And this will typically be an event that's hosted once a month or so. All right, so first of all then, or maybe last of all, I suppose, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, who is a friend of mine from a time when I used to work at the same university where he continues to work. So it's great to have you here. And as you said before, getting a chance to speak on something that you're going to geek out about, which I think is pretty fun. So Mark Bruce, Dr. Mark Bruce is currently an associate professor of English at Bethel University, where he teaches courses in pre-modern literatures, Shakespeare, world literature, and literary theory. He is the editor with Catherine Terrell of Hamilton College of the collection, The Anglo-Scottish Borders and the Shaping of Identity, 1300 to 1600. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, as well as the Scottish Medievalists Society, and the author of numerous articles and book chapters on late medieval Scottish and English literature and culture. And I believe he's actually also related distantly to Robert the Bruce. Is that correct?
Very distantly. Very distantly.
Very distantly, yes. So anyway, his talk tonight is titled Misusing the Medieval, John Eldridge and the Unreal, William Wallace. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As I said, it's not often I get to be a public geek as opposed to a purely academic geek. So I'm looking forward to geeking out with all of you tonight. To start out, this is a quote from near the end of John Eldridge's book, Wild at Heart. I want to love with much more abandon and stop waiting for others to love me first. I want to hurl myself into a creative work worthy of God. I want to charge the fields of Bannockburn. Follow Peter as he followed Christ out onto the sea. Pray from my heart's true desire. The above passage appears near the end of Wild at Heart, Discovering the Secret of a Man's Soul, John Eldredge's best-selling evangelical manifesto for recovering an authentic masculinity he feels is lost to contemporary American Christian men. It appears as a summation of much of what has come before in the book, themes of embracing risk, blessing natural, quote unquote, natural masculine aggressiveness, and living honestly from one's own divinely implanted core desires. One of the items on this list, to borrow an axiom from Sesame Street, is not like the others. The first item concerns loving without expectation of reward. The second is about creativity. The penultimate item is an image of an act of pure faith in Christ, Peter leaving the boat. And the last conveys a desire for authentic prayer. These are all very noble and very spiritual and personal kinds of goals. The consistency of these items makes the remaining third item, which is the reference to the 1314 Battle of Bannockburn, seem oddly out of place. What have the other items to do with a 700-year-old bloody conflict between English and Scottish armies? In the context of the rest of Wild at Heart, the image of Bannockburn can only invoke the host of earlier references Eldredge has made throughout the book to the legendary Scottish national hero William Wallace, specifically as portrayed in the 1995 Mel Gibson film Braveheart. Eldredge frequently invokes Wallace as sort of his poster child for authentic Christian masculinity, the man who fought for what he believed in when the other quote unquote Pharisaic conciliatory Scots nobles would not. But the reference is problematic. For one thing, Wallace had been dead for 9 years when the Battle of Bannockburn took place. And the one who led the charge at Bannockburn was Robert Bruce, to whom I'm only very distantly related, whom Eldredge, along with the film, sees as one of the conciliatory nobles mentioned earlier. For another, the reference adds an unsettling political valence to a list of items presented as spiritual equivalents. For Eldredge, the image of charging the fields at Bannockburn represents a leap of faith equivalent to Peter's. But Bannockburn, even in the world of Braveheart, was not a matter of spiritual faith. It was about political sovereignty. And even if Wallace had led that charge, the reference still endangers Eldredge's point in ways he doesn't seem to recognize. Eldredge identifies the ideas of a battle to fight and a beauty to fight for as two of the deepest, most authentic desires of the Christian man, desires that by strong association, if not direct reference, Wallace embodies. In the film, however, Wallace's wife is killed early on. Her murder a significant motivation for the Wallace character's continued fight against the English. While Wallace then certainly has a battle to fight and a beauty to fight for, Wallace's battle, even in the film, is a nationalist rather than a spiritual one. And his test of faith is not about faith in Christ, but in a partisan political identity. And the beauty for which he fights is revenge. The Bannockburn reference thus points away from the spiritual authenticity indicated by the other items in the list and toward a very human, not to mention very post-medieval construct. That is the idea of political loyalty to a nation state. And toward a brand of masculine desire that is, to be sure, deeply human, but not necessarily laudable or Christ-like. So the figure of William Wallace, at least I would like to suggest, is central to Eldredge's program in Wild at Heart. And his use of Wallace is emblematic of nearly all of Eldredge's many references to film and popular culture throughout the book. For Eldredge, Wallace is more than just a comic book ideal and more than just an example of the kind of figure to which men respond and as such an indicator of real, authentic masculine desires. Wallace in Wild at Heart is a central figure of authentic masculinity itself, kind of the embodiment of what for Eldredge modern Christianity, the embodiment of what for Eldredge modern Christian masculinity has lost and what it must recover. But what exactly is being recovered in the figure of Wallace, and what are the consequences of that recovery? I would like to present a reading of the medieval origins and history of the legend of William Wallace to suggest that what Eldredge sees as an authentic masculinity worthy of recovery is indeed anything but authentic, but rather almost entirely created and an almost always politically interested fantasy. I'll also suggest that the 15th century poet Blind Harry, whose poem, and this is a very long title for a poem, I know, "The Acts and Deeds of the Illustrious and Valiant Champion Sir William Wallace, Knight of Elderslie," is the source of most of the Braveheart narrative, actually expresses an awareness and a pointed critique of precisely the use of the Wallace legend that Eldredge employs. Harry's poem undermines as a dangerous and destructive fantasy precisely the version of Wallace Eldredge wishes to recover as honorable and authentic. By examining what we know about the historical Wallace, and by reading Harry's Wallace Against Wild at Heart and adopting as critical tools both historiography and the strategies by which Harry undermines the authenticity of the character of Wallace in his own poem, we can see more clearly both the politically loaded constructedness of the Wallace legend and the potential consequences to the faith and humanity of Eldredge's audience of recovering Wallace as a figure of authentic masculine desire. So this is part one now, which I've entitled "Real Men Wear Kilts: The Function of William Wallace in Wild at Heart." Eldredge uses the figure of Wallace most overtly in a couple of ways. For one, he cites Braveheart several times as a film to which men typically respond positively, and the Wallace character as a figure that many men wish to be like. Eldredge points to this kind of reaction to Braveheart and other typical guy movies. He also mentions films like Gladiator, The Bridge on the River Kwai, and Shane, to name a few other examples, as evidence of what men deep down truly desire. For another, Eldredge uses Wallace as a figure that embodies the more aggressive, adventurous, and iconoclastic qualities he sees as exhibited by Jesus in the Gospels. Eldredge suggests essentially that while Christ might be a gentle Mother Teresa type figure to the oppressed and disadvantaged, he's more like Wallace toward the Pharisaic and hypocritical. Eldredge does have a point in both cases. It's probably true that many men respond positively to films like Braveheart and wish to feel more like an action hero than a bureaucrat. Neither are men's responses to films like Braveheart necessarily illegitimate as evidence. We can always learn a great deal about a culture from the stories its members create and to which they respond the most positively. It is also true that Jesus was not always, or even fundamentally, a merely or blandly nice guy. He did exhibit emotions like anger and even aggressiveness when confronted with hypocrisy. And what, after all, is wrong with offering up a fictional character as such an example to emulate? The problem here is that Eldredge's use of Wallace on a more detailed examination goes deeper and is much more central to his argument than a mere exemplum or simply as evidence of the type of narrative to which men respond. One difficulty with Eldredge's use of Braveheart, and I think most of his pop culture references, is that he fails to account, I think, for the possibility that films such as Braveheart do not simply reflect masculine desires in contemporary evangelical culture, but also have a role in creating and calibrating those desires, something I'll talk about more a little bit later. Even more important, though, is the centrality of the kind of identity the Braveheart Wallace represents to the primary project of Wild at Heart. From the beginning of the book and its first references to Wallace, Eldredge characterizes his project and the project in which he encourages Christian men to engage as one of a recovery of a lost identity. Eldredge repeatedly characterizes that identity as something more authentic, more real than what men currently have, and that aligns that lost identity with men's true nature. That nature, Eldredge argues, is specifically God-given. Almost immediately, Eldredge links this lost identity with medieval Scotland and Wallace via Braveheart. Eldredge begins the passage in which he first refers directly to Wallace with the story of a friend of his named Craig, who as an adult chose to adopt the surname of his real father, who had been killed in the Korean War when Craig was a young child. When Craig discovered that his father was killed in combat and that his grandfather was an early missionary to Central America, I'm quoting here, Craig changed his name to McConnell and with it took back a much more noble identity. Eldridge goes on to suggest that as many men are ashamed of their immediate fathers, that they go deeper into their own roots, as did Craig, to find a father figure from whom they can recover a more authentic masculine identity, all the way back to the one, quote, whose image every man bears. Moving on to ask what Jesus was or is specifically as a man, Eldridge decries the typical image of the mild and gentle Jesus, which he refers to as Mr. Rogers with a beard, and rejects it. Quote, telling me to be like him feels like telling me to go limp and passive. Be nice, be swell, be like Mother Teresa. I'd much rather be like William Wallace. It's important to notice here that what Eldridge is interested in recovering is not precisely a historical personage, but rather a type of identity. Eldridge encourages men via the anecdote about Craig to make what Walter Benjamin might call a, quote, tiger's leap into the past, skipping intervening generations until one finds an object worthy of recovery, an object that supports the new brand of identity one wishes to create. Excuse me. Identity then is in one way connected to and in another way severed from historical reality. On the one hand, historicity seems to matter to Eldridge. Authentic identity is located in the past. On the other, one seems free to ignore any part of that past that isn't suitable for recovery. One can be selective about what one chooses to resurrect. There's also an odd slippage here in exactly what Eldridge suggests we recover. That object of recovery in this passage starts out looking like Christ, the one whose image we all bear, as he existed specifically as a man. But Eldridge's logic doesn't leave us simply with a more masculine version of Christ in this instance. After telling Craig's story of resurrecting a more masculine father figure from his own history, Eldridge laments the gentle images of Mother Teresa and the Mr. Rogers-like Christ that seem to him prevalent in Christian culture, concluding that he'd rather be like William Wallace. From there, Eldridge continues with an account of Wallace that strangely conflates the fictional account of Wallace in Braveheart with a historical account of Wallace, characterizing the Scottish nobles in the late 1300s as, quote, typical Pharisees, bureaucrats, religious administrators who niggle and simper in order to hold on to land and power. Eldridge then contrasts Wallace's masculine violence with the Scots nobles' feminine negotiation, quoting the well-known freedom speech from the film and noting Wallace's willingness to pick a fight rather than negotiate. From here, Eldridge moves to a discussion of Jesus, noting scriptural passage in which Jesus expresses anger in the face of religious hypocrisy, making that strange tiger's leap connection between late medieval Scottish nobles and first century Pharisees. I'm quoting him here. The Pharisees are like the Scottish nobles. They too load heavy burdens on the back of God's people, but do not lift a finger to help them. Jesus for Eldridge is the one that picks a fight with the hypocritical Pharisees, just as Wallace did with the Scottish nobility. The direction of Eldridge's logic is important here. He does not move from the example of Christ, expressing a desire to be like Christ and suggesting that Wallace is a Christ-like figure. Rather, Eldridge begins with the figure of Wallace, expressing his own desire to be like Wallace, and then suggests not that Wallace was Christ-like, but rather that Christ was Wallace-like. Wallace, and specifically the version of Wallace characterized in the movie Braveheart, is the primary value. Eldridge leaves the discussion then less with a masculinized Christ than with a sacralized William Wallace. Wallace here is the figure that Eldridge associates most directly with the concept of recovery. The qualities embodied in Wallace are the ones Eldridge wishes to mine from the past and re-inject into a Christian concept of masculinity, remaking Jesus Christ into William Wallace's image. Which leads me to part two, which is called But Wallace Didn't, wear a kilt, that is. The historical Wallace and the construction of the Braveheart legend. In other words, Eldridge seems to do more than simply point to a fictional figure to which men respond positively. He presents Wallace as a figure of a more authentic kind of masculinity that he locates in the historical past. Being more like William Wallace is more real, in other words, not simply because it presents an image of masculinity that is appealing in the present, but rather one that is worthy of recovery because its location in the past is what makes it more authentic. Eldridge seems to regain from that past something that men have lost in that present. But to borrow another childhood axiom, if we're going to pick something up out of the past and incorporate it into ourselves, it might be worth asking where that thing has been and what it may have picked up along the way. Exactly what is the nature of the figure of William Wallace that Eldridge adopts as a model of authentic masculinity? A look at what little we know about the historical Wallace can help to highlight the nature and significance of the characters portrayed in Braveheart and Wild at Heart. First thing to know is that there has never been very much reliable documentary evidence at all concerning Wallace. The first historical look we have at him comes when he seems to burst onto the scene of a widespread Scottish popular rebellion against English rule in 1297, in chronicle accounts written well after the fact. Given the snail's pace at which information traveled in medieval Scotland, it's unlikely that even the Scots rebels at the time had anything like that kind of impression. And even in the modern histories, the beginning of the usual narrative of Wallace's participation in the uprising curiously predates the evidence we have of the same. To quote one biographer, he sprang full blown, as it were, into the national consciousness in 1297 and has remained there ever since. The first documentary of evidence of Wallace as a fighter for the Scottish cause appears in relation to his murder of an English sheriff at a place called Lanark in May of 1297. The reason for the murder is not given, although historian Andrew Fisher speculates that he may have needed no more reason than just to disrupt English governmental operations in that area. Wallace springs up suddenly in English chronicles too, also generally written well after the fact, at also about that time, as a sort of dark Scottish monster, the sort of figure that you threaten your child with to get to bed, or the Wallace will come and get you. The Chronicle of Lanercost, which is a Northern English chronicle, says that in 1297, Bishop Robert Wishart and James the Steward, the initial leaders of the rebellion, quote, not daring openly to break their pledged faith to the king, caused a certain bloody man, William Wallace, who had formerly been a chief of brigands in Scotland, to revolt against the king and assemble the people in his support. There's not much detail concerning Wallace's subsequent life. We know that he led the Scottish force with Andrew Moray at the Battle of Stirling Bridge a few years later. We know he was knighted sometime before 1298 and elected a guardian of Scotland shortly thereafter. We know that he issued documents in the name of John Balliol, who was the deposed Scottish king, that he participated in various military encounters, including raiding in northern England and the Scottish defeat at Falkirk, after which he relinquished his guardianship. And we know he led diplomatic missions to the French court and to the papal curia at Avignon. Finally, we know that he was captured and executed by the English in 1305. Further details concerning all of these exploits are colored by their origins in very partisan and often highly fictionalized sources, the foremost being Blind Harry's Wallace and a handful of later chronicles. Only 3 documents thought to be in Wallace's own hands survive. Moreover, as recent work by historian James Fraser indicates, even the accounts in the earliest chronicle sources alter events in politically interested ways. Fraser notes that one of the earliest narratives of Wallace in a chronicle that we now know as the Gesta Annalia II was comprised of, quote, a story devised neither to give Wallace his due nor to set the record straight, but to strengthen and deepen the acceptability of Robert Bruce as hero and king. Not for the last time, the image of William Wallace became more important than the historical reality. And this is the case even in the earliest, mostly documentary sources we have of his life. Aside from these few chronological details, then, the majority of William Wallace's life is uncertain, an absence filled in with narrative, learned deduction and conjecture, speculation, myth, folk tradition, and outright fiction. The sheer volume of this conjectural and fictional material overwhelms the scant details of the historical person. What the name William Wallace invoked in late 15th century Scotland, as it does now, could only be a fictive cultural creation, a sort of aggregation of the strata of narrative plaster layered over the gaps that are really all we have of his existence. Even a cursory comparison of the Braveheart version of Wallace with the above historical information can help reveal some of the constructedness and interestedness of the figure Eldridge adopts as a model for authentic masculinity. For example, the film portrays Wallace's murder of the Sheriff of Lanark as motivated by revenge for the sheriff's murder of Wallace's wife, a scenario supplied by later legend and embellished accounts of Wallace's life. We have no documentary evidence that suggests he was ever married. What we know from documentary evidence is that he did in fact kill the English Sheriff of Lanark, but there is no evidence of a murdered wife, and really no reason to believe the incident was more than what it appears to be, a guerrilla raid. The murdered wife part of the story is most likely a fabrication, one that supplies a nobler motive for Wallace's otherwise merely violent action, and becomes an emblem for the heroic Wallace's desire to protect home and family, an idea much more compatible with the status of a national hero than a simple guerrilla raid. Already here, we can begin to see how the film, not to mention its earlier sources, alters the reality to create a sort of nationalist myth. The film's visuals participate in the creation of this nationalist myth. This is where we get into kilts, for those who are interested in Scottish things. To mention only one costuming example, one of the largest deviations from history in the film is the fact that Wallace wears a kilt. There is in fact no evidence of tartan kilts being worn in Scotland before the 16th century. Even if they were, a Normanized lowland minor noble such as Wallace would probably not have worn one in any case, and very likely would have considered it below his station to do so. The kilt Mel Gibson wears in the film would be roughly accurate to the 17th and 18th centuries. You'd have seen Scots wearing great kilts of that kind during, say, the 30 Years' War, but not at Stirling or Bannockburn. So why put Gibson in a kilt, which the film's production designers were certainly savvy enough to realize was a serious anachronism? Certainly a large part of the answer to this question lies in the nature of filmic communication. The designers and directors surely needed a way to visually differentiate Scottish and English characters. Historically, Lowland Scots dress and English dress, especially among the aristocratic classes, would have been quite similar in the 13th and 14th centuries. So historical accuracy would have confused the film's audiences. And kilts, on the other hand, immediately register as Scottish to a present-day movie-going audience. The kilt, of course, is symbolically linked with Scottish nationhood as the national costume. So consequently, this simple costuming decision makes the film's hero refer in a nationalist sort of direction. Wallace fights here not for King John, his feudal suzerain, which was what he always characterized himself as fighting for, but for Scotland, the nation. Wallace is not simply a hero in Braveheart, but a national hero, symbolizing loyalty to a kind of national identity that very arguably did not exist at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. Perhaps the most significant change from the historical to the fictional Wallace is one that an audience of Braveheart would not be equipped to see or realize at all, which is that Wallace characterized himself as fighting for something other than the political sovereignty of a nation state. In his function as guardian of Scotland, Wallace invariably acted in the name of King John Balliol, the Scottish monarch whom Edward I of England had deposed. What this means is that Wallace's loyalties, historically speaking, were feudal, not national. His allegiance was not to a nation state, but rather to a particular monarch and a particular line of regnal succession. The Wallace legend, however, changes this element of his character even in its earliest iterations, making Wallace fight for Scotland rather than for King John. In Braveheart, Wallace fights for an even more abstract term, freedom, in such a way that his actions come to seem more like those of a colonial American revolutionary than a 13th century knight who probably saw himself as fighting on behalf of his feudal suzerain. Such an idea is only reinforced by the fact that Mel Gibson could go on several years later to recycle the entire plot of Braveheart and with little more than a change of costume create the movie The Patriot. Another detail concerning the historical Wallace begins to demonstrate that not only does the Braveheart legend alter the historical record in a nationalistic direction, but the direction of a particularly aggressive form of nationalism as well. One of the things we know about the historical Wallace was that he was quite literate, and not only a warrior, but also a politician and a diplomat. When Edward I deposed King John and invaded and took direct control over Scotland in 1298, any Scottish polity ceased to exist. Scotland had become, in effect, a new northern county of England under an English system of law, an English bureaucracy, and an English church. Wallace's rebellion then involved more than military engagement. As the guardian of the realm, part of Wallace's function was to begin to set up a working Scottish government and bureaucracy with, we can certainly assume, all the mundanity and Pharisaic political niggling such work entails. We also know that he led major diplomatic missions to the French court and to the papal court at Avignon. Braveheart, of course, the movie, elides all this activity. One reason for this is certainly because battles make more striking cinema than negotiations, but such deviation from history is not without rhetorical consequence. By eliding Wallace's role as a politician and diplomat and highlighting his role as a fighter, the focus of the legend gravitates toward an emphasis on violent nationalism. The central heroic quality of the Wallace of Braveheart is his aggression, and his aggression always works in a nationalist direction. Krista Kanitz, another scholar who talks about this, goes so far as to suggest that the film Braveheart, actually aligns goodness and authenticity with illiteracy and aggression. She says, I'm quoting her here, the director's verbal and visual statements create a forceful impression of incontrovertible authenticity and apparent historical accuracy, suggesting to viewers that this simpler age, when villains were clearly evil and members of the social, political, and economic elite, and when heroes were clearly good and politically and economically underprivileged, provides a role model for the contemporary little guy whose noble fight for the greater good will all be validated by later history. In other words, it's not so much that the Wallace as portrayed in the film is a representative of a historically authentic masculinity, as it is that the film uses the techniques of filmic fantasy building to create the idea that Wallace represents a historically authentic masculinity and makes it seem to be true in the absence of any historical reality. The Wallace of Braveheart is not an example of historically authentic views of masculinity, but rather a vehicle to lead audiences to believe that the brand of masculinity the film's creators wish to promote carries a historical authenticity that it really lacks. Put more succinctly, the film is designed to make fantasy seem like reality. And it is this fantasy primarily for which Eldridge seems to fall in Wild at Heart. Leading me to part 3, which is called Eldridge's Unreal Man. Recall the point made above that the film elides Wallace's historically very important diplomatic activity. Wallace, in other words, was a literate politician as well as a fighter. But the literate characters in Braveheart, that is the ones who seem to be concerned with things like texts and diplomacy, are invariably coded not only as the bad guys, but sexually deviant as well. Both the Sheriff of Lanark and Edward I attempt to sexually coerce both of Wallace's love interests in the film. And the character of Edward of Caernarvon, the son of Longshanks, is portrayed quite anachronistically as a simpering present-day stereotype of an effeminate gay man. This would not have been the historical reality. We know, for example, that Edward of Caernarvon was a successful contestant in tournaments which means that like any male of his social class, he would have been trained from his 7th year to be comfortable fighting on horseback for long periods of time while wearing several hundred pounds of body armor. He hardly would have appeared effeminate to a modern eye, even though some period sources do suggest that he had sexual relationships with male favorites, although it's impossible to determine with complete certainty whether that's true. And while not much of a tactician, Edward famously blundered at the Battle of Bannockburn, allowing the canny Robert Bruce to win the day. Edward was known to be both proficient and vigorous in individual combat. Going back to Krista Canitz, she further explains that, quote, false truth claims are used to further substantiate this naively idealistic notion that cultural regeneration depends on the true, though illiterate, bearer of the chivalric spirit, namely the peasant armed with ethical and spiritual weapons and fighting overwhelmingly powerful opponents who not only control the economic and political resources, but also know how to manipulate the written record and can bury the record of history deep in the archives or prevent it from being written before, or otherwise prevent it from being written before. For Canitz and Sharp, in other words, the film intentionally aligns authentic masculinity with illiteracy. Braveheart's vision of the real man is characterized as the one who is illiterate, violent, unwilling to negotiate, and sexually heteronormative. The villains of the film are literate, engage in diplomacy, and coded as sexually deviant. Yet historically, Wallace was an accomplished diplomat as well as a fighter. Edward of Caernarvon, though not as effective a king as his father, was a trained warrior. And Edward Longshanks wielded diplomacy, law, and violence equally well, and his 20-year marriage to Eleanor of Castile was known as a happy one. This brings the discussion back to Eldridge, because it is precisely this image of Wallace, the aggressive, wronged commoner who eschews the Pharisaic niggling of the diplomats, that Eldridge not only lionizes, but sacralizes. In Eldridge's account in Wild at Heart, the weak Scottish leaders want to negotiate a treaty with England that will buy them more lands and power. They are, I'm quoting Eldridge here, typical Pharisees, bureaucrats, religious administrators. Then when the Pharisaic nobles begin to flee, Wallace rides in with his band of warriors, blue war paint on their faces, another historical anachronism, by the way, ready for battle. Finishing his description of Wallace as the underdog leader who picks a fight, Eldridge asks, now is Jesus more like Mother Teresa or William Wallace? Answering his own question by arguing that Jesus is only like Mother Teresa toward the helpless and oppressed, whereas he is a Wallace-like character toward the Pharisaic and the hypocritical. Eldridge supports this with a story from the Gospel of Luke, in which Jesus heals a crippled woman and is criticized by the leader in charge of the synagogue for doing so on the Sabbath. Jesus, of course, calls out the leader for his hypocrisy. This, for Eldridge, aligns Wallace with Jesus. They both call out the hypocrisy of the sanctimonious bureaucrats and instead take action themselves. It might be noted, however, that Wallace's action is somewhat different than Jesus. Despite the one similarity Eldridge notes, Jesus, for one thing, doesn't kill his enemy. Wallace kind of kills his in droves. In fact, in the same passage in Luke, which Eldridge quotes completely, shows Jesus using argumentation in order to shame the synagogue leader. He says, you hypocrite, you work on the Sabbath day. Don't you untie your ox or your donkey from their stalls on the Sabbath and lead them out for water? Wasn't it necessary for me, even on the Sabbath day, to free this dear woman from the bondage in which Satan has held her for 18 years? Jesus in this passage certainly acts, but he acts precisely by exposing a contradiction in the synagogue leader's logic. Jesus here teaches his enemy. Wallace just kills them. Nevertheless, the single similarity between Jesus and Wallace, action in the face of hypocrisy, is enough for Wallace to become Eldridge's poster child for what it means to be an authentically Christ-like man, the one who picks a fight. Immediately following this discussion in Wild at Heart is a section entitled A Battle to Fight, which identifies that ideal as a primary component of Christian manhood. Eldridge's overall idea, to be fair, is that Wallace is an ideal for Christian men because he's an alternative to the simpering Mr. Rogers stereotype that in Eldridge's view, many men feel pressured to become in present-day American Christian culture. Many men, Eldridge relates, feel great fear of failure, identifying with the film's version of Wallace and wanting to be that kind of hero, but feel more like the simpering aristocrats and bureaucrats. Eldridge's purpose, I think, in using Wallace in this way is primarily to affirm that identification of the man who acts, who has chosen a falsely lived life. This, however, is where Eldridge, quite possibly unintentionally, wades into dangerous waters. The image of Wallace, after all, comes freighted with much more than the simple idea of a life lived honestly and directly. And the image of Wallace that brings all that baggage into play is every bit as unreal and every bit as much of a cultural creation as the unreal brand of masculinity Eldridge wishes to counteract. The quest to be like Wallace doesn't end in greater authenticity. It ends in an even greater illusion. And that illusion brings with it elements that have their own consequences. It's interesting to note that Blind Harry, once again, Blind Harry is the name of the 15th century poet whose poem is the source of most of the narrative material in the film Braveheart and entirely fictionalized. Unlike both Eldridge and the producers of Braveheart, he actually seems to recognize the illusory nature of Wallace's nationalist quest, and especially later in the poem represents Wallace himself as increasingly disillusioned about and regretful of his program of nationalistic violence, which leads him in the end into deception after deception, and even into a final deception that leads to his capture and execution by the English. Several violent episodes near the end of the poem are explicitly critiqued on Christian grounds, leading the poem's 20th century editor, Matthew McDermott, to remark that Christ's way and that of either side are hardly the same, and the poet knows it. Later, several other similarly grisly episodes are contrasted directly with Christianity in ways that suspend any kind of national reference. In a violent military action late in the poem, Wallace demonstrates a curious respect for the enemy commander, watching him array his troops for battle. Wallace comments that pleasant it is to see a chieftain go so chieftain-like. Harry describes the direct acts of wounding in the ensuing battle once again in a manner that seems to concentrate on the violence itself while avoiding direct national reference. Sharp spears, I'm translating from Scott's here, sharp spears flew fast on either side through bright armor, made wounds deep and wide. When the Scots finally prevail, Harry comments, of Christian blood, it was great sin for wrong-wise cause and had been many a day. James Goldstein notes that the word blood is given particular significance throughout the poem, which takes pains to which takes significant pains to differentiate the good Scottish blood from the false blood of the English. That observation makes it all the more curious in this instance that Harry should refer to the blood of those on both sides in terms of a common characteristic, their Christianity, going so far as to say that to spill so much Christian blood on both sides was a great sin. Such a statement can hardly fail to create an uncomfortable contrast with the idea of righteous violence with which much of the rest of the poem seems to resound, a reminder that the religion those on both sides share is one that does not differentiate, to borrow a phrase from its central text, between Jew or Greek, slave or free. The theme of questioning violence on Christian grounds deepens toward the end of the poem. At the very end of the narrative, Harry relates a vision experienced by an unnamed monk just after Wallace's execution. As the story goes, an aged brother of the monk's had agreed to visit him after his death, if possible, in order to tell him about the afterlife. The old brother's ghost does indeed appear, informing the monk that he's currently in purgatory. The monk asks him how long he'll be there, and the old brother replies that he has to wait for two others to pass on to heaven before him, one of whom he identifies as, quote, a great slayer of men. The monk replies that, quote, "that tale is but in vain, for slaughter is abominable to God." The brother explains, however, that the person in question is Wallace, who was a defender of Scotland, who killed in the course of a righteous war. On one level, this seems to vindicate Wallace, but the very fact that the question of whether or not his slaughter was an inhuman abomination is raised at all in this context adds more than a touch of uneasiness concerning Wallace's single-minded violence. This irony perhaps becomes stronger in the final events of the poem. First, the Archbishop of Canterbury defies Edward I, who had prohibited any priests from visiting Wallace on pain of death in order to hear Wallace's confession, calling Edward a heretic toward God, who was the only righteous king. The suggestion that the concerns of the one righteous king trump the interests of any earthly one seems to cast even more doubt retroactively on the notion of the righteousness of Wallace's violence. Finally, Wallace is granted as a last request to have a psalter, a psalm book, he's carried with him since childhood, held within his sight by a priest throughout his execution. The only actual detail given of his execution, the torture, is completely elided, unlike in the film where he's very gruesomely tortured to death, while holding a handkerchief that belonged to his murdered wife, who didn't actually exist. The only actual detail we get of his execution in the poem is, quote, "steadfast he read, for aught they did him there. Good devotion was his beginning, contained therewith, and fair was his ending." Wallace's life then does not simply end with him steadfastly reading his psalter. That life is also seen as bracketed by good devotion at the beginning and at the end, leaving open to question the actions in between, especially in light of the previous contrasts the poet has made between nationalist violence and Christian doctrine. This sense deepens when one considers what would be the most familiar words of the Psalter to Harry's audience, and the ones at which Wallace himself is staring as he dies. It would be the first page of Psalm 1. "Blessed is he who does not abide in the counsel of the impious, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." In the poem, this is what Wallace is staring at as he's being executed. With the actual scene of Wallace's torture elided, the passage thus creates an odd focus for the end of a poem that has consistently presented Wallace as the sacrificing hero of the Scottish religion. Since here at the end of Wallace's life, at the very scene of what should be his martyrdom for the national cause, national reference falls away, overpowered with this sense of Christian spirituality. Wallace receives his final reward, his lasting bliss, not because of his devotion to Scotland, but solely because of his devotion at the beginning and end of his life to God. It is his good devotion that Harry says brings about his fair ending. The only national reference in the passage mentions that several English people said that Wallace felt no pain during his torture as he steadfastly read his psalter, his unbreakable focus on the purely spiritual, negating the nationalized violence being wrought upon his own body. If Wallace then is treated throughout the poem as a sacrificing martyr for the religion of Scottish nationalism, he is apostate to that religion at the end. Consequently, though the poem maintains its nationalist flavor, Harry, unlike Eldridge, does not allow Wallace's nationalized violence to pass unquestioned on Christian grounds. The problem then is not so much that Eldridge lionizes action, even aggressive action, but rather that he uses the Wallace legend in conjunction with what becomes a sort of sacralization of aggression. This is the central message of Wild at Heart. Aggression is a God-given masculine trait. Bless that aggression, use it, act. Don't be the niggling aristocrat, be the Wallace who picks a fight. But there's something about Eldridge's use of that fight-picking scene. There's something telling about Eldridge's use of that fight-picking scene. In the film, that scene is followed by a massive battle, which, though graphic, is still a much whitewashed rendition of the carnage of medieval combat. Even so, the film and Harry acknowledge that when Wallace picks a fight, he picks a fight with someone. And that someone is not a disembodied concept. It's a very embodied national army full of very embodied Christian humans. Eldridge, however, skips the combat, emphasizing Wallace's action over and against not the English, but the niggling Scottish aristocrats, his aggression overcoming their hypocrisy. Even in the film, though, Wallace's fight against Scottish hypocrisy leaves quite a mound of English and Scottish bodies in its wake. The idea that Eldridge misses then in this passage and elsewhere is that even the character of Wallace realizes, and that even the character of Wallace realizes all too well in Harry's medieval poem, is that aggression is a transitive condition, requiring not only a subject, but an object. Eldridge deals only with aggression in terms of its subject, the desire on the part of the aggressor, never quite acknowledging the reality that aggression has to land somewhere, must be enacted against someone. Whether for just reasons or no, aggression, as Blind Harry recognizes, necessarily entails a real human cost. And if aggression needs an object, and if Eldridge, in his sacralization of aggression, does not consciously supply an object, where is that sacralized aggression most likely to land? Where is it most likely to find an object? The most obvious answer to this is the object supplied not by scripture, but rather by the objects of aggression encoded in the mythic story of Wallace that Eldridge invokes, ideological opponents in a nationalist struggle. In the film, Wallace fights for two things: vengeance for his fictional murdered wife and for Scotland's independence from English rule. In other words, the object that the Wallace story supplies for masculine aggression is an ideological other. By default, it's a political and ideological enemy that enters into Eldridge's narrative as the threat to authentic Christian masculinity. What Eldridge winds up sacralizing then is not simply an illusory image of masculinity, but a very politically loaded and directed illusory image of masculinity. The use of Wallace as an icon of Christian masculinity does not simply recommend action over inaction, but action against a political enemy represented in the film by the niggling Scots nobles and simpering sexually deviant English aristocrats that threatens to emasculate the authentic Christian masculine subject. What might it mean to assert that brand of masculinity in the context of a present-day community of Christians? Well, that's probably a subject for a whole nother talk, but suffice it to suggest here simply that Eldridge's invocation of Wallace as a model for authentic Christian masculinity is not only an illusion, but a violent one, directed against an emasculating ideological other that is presented as a political enemy, with whom, one might wonder, will Wallace's present-day Christian imitators choose to pick a fight? Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got some questions. I've got a couple of questions. It looks like Elaine online has a question. Elaine, you want to unmute yourself? I think you're still muted, Elaine.
No,
Nope, she's still muted.
can't hear you.
I think I did it this time.
Oh,
Yeah.
there we are.
There we go.
So Dr. Bruce, you've made a very strong case for not holding up William Wallace as an ideal for Christian men. And I think it has important implications. I have some questions. Not knowing very much, if anything, about Eldridge and Wild at Heart, or even Braveheart for that matter, I consulted my go-to resource authority on books, Amazon, and I found out that there's only one of these Wild at Heart books left in stock. There are 4,500 plus ratings that have been made of this book, 85% of which are rated at 5, 9% for, which means 94% of the people, the 4,000 plus people who rated it highly. And so my questions are, why is it so popular? Especially apparently with evangelical Christians. What are the implications of that popularity, which you kind of hinted at in your last sentence? Implications for our culture and our country. And what do your students have to say about this book?
It is super popular. As a matter of fact, it's even recently out in a new expanded edition, I believe. And I think the answers to that are pretty simple. Number one, it's really entertaining for exactly the same reason that films like Braveheart are really entertaining. And it is. It's an incredibly entertaining movie. It's a great underdog flick. What I worry about, I suppose, is that, you know, we've seen, as in terms of implications, but I think probably one of the reasons that it's so popular is that stories like Wallace, stories like the story of Wallace as it's presented in Braveheart, are simply hugely entertaining stories, and they're hugely satisfying stories. But I think one of the things that Eldridge kind of misses is the idea that those stories aren't just about reflecting pre-existing desires in their audiences, but they also do some things to implant those kinds of desires in their audiences. And so is it really evidence that is the fact that a lot of men respond positively to a film like Braveheart evidence of what men deep down really desire? Or are films like Braveheart telling men what they ought deep down to desire, if that makes some kind of sense? What I worry about is that it's maybe a too easy answer to that question of what should one desire as a Christian man. And once again, because it refers in that kind of nationalist direction, and because it sort of sacralizes this sense of aggression, and doesn't really supply an object for it, what I fear is that the object that is most ready to hand in the story of William Wallace is a political enemy. And so, you know, I do wonder if that doesn't make this kind of view of masculinity a contributor to the kind of, you know, more virulent partisanship that I think everybody's experiencing.
Hold on, I think we've got
boards. Yeah.
Hold on. Let's get you online. Oh,
How could we not listen to this without thinking of January 6th and the militias and the point you just made, that it's not, that how it's moved in the political realm and has something to do with the divide that we live in now.
yeah, and
How do you feel about that? Is that too far of a stretch? Don't you think
I mean,
there's a lot of that kind of mentality behind what we're seeing in interactions?
there's a lot of interest in the Middle Ages in that mentality too. So a lot of the sort of rhetoric that went on before January 6th and platforms like 4chan and things like that referenced William Wallace quite a great deal, referenced medieval Scotland in this kind of mythic presentation a great deal. And you even saw people on the news media, you know, wearing medieval type costumes and things like this.
Some of the people at the insurrection were, a couple of them dressed in kilts, weren't they?
Mhm.
I saw Braveheart when it was new. That won the best picture of the year too. So that gives it more credibility of that year, the movie.
Yeah,
It was
and I
Academy
mean,
Award,
and
and
don't
didn't
get me
Mel
wrong, I
Gibson get
actually
best?
like Braveheart.
Yeah, it
I
was
mean,
2 parts, took 2 VHSs
yeah,
to watch it. It was so long. Yeah.
I think it's a fun movie, right?
Yeah,
You know,
well, it's
make the popcorn,
brutal. And his death was. but,
enjoy, but it goes so far to try to present itself as having a kind of historical authenticity that it lacks, that and tries to draw on that sense of historical authenticity to try to naturalize its ideas that are really very modern. Braveheart is actually a Western. Just in very anachronistic medieval clothing.
So that it must fit with Kristen Dumas's Jesus and John Wayne kind of analysis of the John Waynification of, Christian manhood or that kind of thing.
Yes,
Okay.
I think, and she talks about Eldridge too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I have like 3 or 4 questions, but are there other folks over here before I talk? It's already on.
It's not-
You get a little bit of feedback.
Oh, I see why.
So you can turn that off. Just speak to the box.
Okay.
Right before you-
Okay, but I should go.
Yeah.
Okay.
please.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm curious because Elaine's last question about your college students, because I would imagine, John, I mean, Wild at Heart is not a huge text in colleges right now, unless this new edition has come to resurgence.
It has been. So, I mean, the only thing I can really tell you about my college students, I don't get a chance to talk about this book with them very much because it's not a book that I teach.
Shocking.
We're too busy reading Chaucer and things like this. But sometimes I do, like when I'm doing get to know you exercises with students at the beginning of the semester. One of the questions that I'll ask, or one of the questions that I'll ask in a kind of get to know you survey, is about a good book you read last, or something about your favorite book, or something like that. And Wild at Heart does come up fairly frequently.
Okay, so the reason I asked that is Wild at Heart came out when I was in college.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm graduated and gone through seminary over 7 years and been in a doctoral program for 8. So that should give you a hint that I wasn't in college yesterday. So that's interesting, because I would presume the legacy of it, but it's interesting that folks are still reading it, because I would have thought it more, but clearly there's a new edition. So that's interesting. I'll offer a couple comments, but then if we have time, I'll come back because I have a lot. So this book was really popular when I was a college student.
Yeah, it was immensely popular.
Immensely
at
popular.
that point.
Yeah. And I'd say like the one piece of it, one of the pieces of it that seemed so resonant at the time, and I read it at the time, was this sense of the kind of lostness, a lot of a kind of whole swath of white men in America of like, what does it mean to be man?
Mhm.
Right. And so there's this sense of reclamation of identity and being a self, like, and it's interesting to hear you in your paper. And a thing I think personally I feel a lot of grief about right now is the legacy of, in the search for an identity, it eschews a significant portion for Christian men, particularly
Mhm.
cisgender men, that the legacy of Jesus, like where we actually eschew anything of Jesus that's too soft. And also looking at more recently how Mr. Rogers has actually become right, there's
Kind of he's become a little bit more of a masculine hero.
of a hero,
Yeah.
right? So it's like how I think personally I feel grief that there can't be both that speaking of truth to power and that sense of like, where is your own soul and how do you take responsibility to be your own self? And that the way of showing up, like these things have to be maintained together. And and how that was not part of Eldridge's vision. He says you care for the weaklings, right? You care
Right.
for the poor, the oppressed, but Jesus actually a soft figure, Jesus as one who takes in the form of a servant, becomes obedient to death, even death on a cross, and not in a, then I overcame. I mean, it's,
Right.
like that gets lost. And the grief of that I feel for, and just seeing the legacies, like I think as I'm listening to talk, the legacies of that, and how now for how long is this, like 20 years? I don't know how old I am.
Yeah.
Let's not quite 20 years. So we'll give it 17 or something. Okay. That's 20 years. So the legacies of this in making for the ways that Mark Driscoll and other church planters have branded then an entire way of, to be evangelical male Christian is to basically be a cage fighter.
Yeah. Well, Mark Driscoll's handle that he used for himself in online forums was William Wallace II.
Yeah. And just so, and here, just a practical story about this, about the side effects of it. When I was 24 years old, I went on a date with a guy who this was his favorite book. And on a date on the back of the car or the moped, he quotes the A Beauty to Fight For of Battle or Rescue.
Battle to Fight and A Beauty to Fight For.
Yeah, something like
Yeah.
that, whatever, right? And a week and a half later, he was kicked out of seminary for stalking me.
Oh my.
Because when it was for him, right? There was trauma. He needed to have something to fight for.
Mhm.
And how that got translated. Of course, that's not the only narrative of how someone lives into that, but just to say in that space, like how this intersects in ways, like how can we, be critically reflective, and how does actually Christ be that, like, that's who we're supposed to be called and informed by, and not William Wallace.
Right.
So just, anyway, thanks for your paper. I'll say more later if we have time.
Okay.
Other comments?
Yeah, just to piggyback on your example quickly, it's when I was listening to you towards the end there, it's got to be a factor in spousal abuse and physical abuse with children. I wonder how it's impacted. I'm just raising that question as how has it impacted
Yeah.
child abuse and spousal abuse? Is that a way to show what a brave, strong, violent person I am?
Yeah. I mean, I know that's not something that Eldridge himself would advocate.
No, I'm not saying
Right,
that,
yeah.
but it could play
But
into that.
it
lead
could
to
have that unforeseen effect. That's what I'm worried about.
Unintended
Yeah.
consequences of where is this violence going to come out if it leads to violence?
So I have several kind of comments, questions, but one question just occurs to me is, I mean, on a certain level, aren't we caught in a kind of bind that's almost impossible to get out of, to a certain extent, in the fact that these gender identities are always constructed?
Yeah.
And so when we think about a different kind of construction, we have to, I suppose, just concede that that's what we're doing. And therefore we need a different set of norms, perhaps, or a different set of when I think of like the kind of the rule of love, for interpreting scripture that Augustine puts forward, or the rule of faith or something like that. Does that seem like that's just part of the dilemma of being human? Because there are no sort of necessarily set down kinds of norms that that are not always already somehow interfacing with the cultural context in which they were set down.
Right.
Okay. Any further comments or? I mean, part of this for me was just like thinking about, because I was thinking about the post-Cold War context, right? The Cold War is over. Braveheart is what, 1996? 95. I mean, I remember that period, and it was sort of like, who's our enemy? What's
Right.
next? And so you could see how that would translate into what does it mean to be a man during this time, or
Sure.
maybe what does it mean to be a woman? And certainly within a Christian context, like that becomes deeply troubling in the sense that like it's clearly a broader cultural conversation that's driving the boat,
Mhm.
as opposed to any kind of attendance to scripture or discipleship or anything like that. But then to concede that maybe that's part of the dilemma that we have, because is there some pure moment that we can turn to that's not already culturally conditioned? I don't know. I think the other thing that struck me was that there were three things that I was thinking of, and the way that what you describe in the dilemma in Eldridge, Braveheart, and even in the poem, and basically the historical fictionalizing and construction of Wallace almost from the beginning,
Yeah.
is that it just does map profoundly onto our current cultural moment.
Mhm.
And there were three examples I thought of. One was that today is the first day of the trial of the people who were involved in the 2017 Charlottesville
Oh, yeah.
event,
Mhm.
where there was lots of medieval imagery.
Absolutely. A lot of medieval Scottish imagery in particular.
Yeah. Then, of course, this podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. So the comment that Sarah made about Mark Driscoll.
Right.
And the reason I knew the date for when the book was published is I looked it up because I was like, well, that's pretty much around the time that Mars Hill kind of starts, 2001. So there clearly is some sort of symbiosis. And then I don't know if you saw, but there was an article in the Atlantic maybe 2 days ago on the ways in which in some churches, for want of a better term, a kind of Trumpification of people can vote for Trump for different kinds of reasons, but sort of the brash side, the sort of, take no prisoner, ideological, you can be mean if you need to be mean. Like that's the way that the article talks about.
Yeah.
And it just seemed to me to strike some of the chords of ideological enemy to which you do nothing but kill.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if there's anything to say there, except that, it's an observation, but I mean, do you see intersections with this book? Do you think Eldridge's book contributes to that? This obviously 20 years ago.
Yeah. But, I mean, in the sense of being part of the whole milieu of historical and cultural phenomena out of which our current moment develops, right? That I think that idea of, and because this book was so influential for so long, I mean, I think it had been out for 10 years when I started thinking about this stuff, and it was still really popular 10 years out from its initial publication, and maybe even at the height of its popularity at that point. With Bible, the publishers are coming out with Bible studies based on it that churches are using as curricula, and all this kind of thing. And so that idea of blessing aggression and seeing any impulse toward negotiation, toward literacy, toward complexity, really, as something that's only done by those potentially sexually deviant elites. Really does have kind of a profound influence on what it means to behave properly as a man in certain contexts, right?
Related to this, I know Braveheart, but I wasn't familiar with the book. Has this infiltrated parenting in church curriculum, as if how people raise male children and how they interact with them, and how this helps shape gender identity in boys, if the parents and the family agree with this, have read it, did the class, as you said, for adults? Well, how is this impacting the rearing of boys and over
Yeah.
time since it was around. And is anybody referring to it in curriculum about parenting?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have data on that, obviously, but certainly I think it would have impacted how people think about raising boys and acculturating boys and things like that. If in no other way, what movies you want to show them?
Yeah, and also the anti-intellectualism of not wanting to learn.
Any concluding comments? Any more comments from folks online?
I think one of the things that that struck me about your paper and just listening to it and thinking about this is also there is a recent TV series. I don't know I think it's actually still going, called Outlander, which is based off of a historical romance series. And this is a huge genre in historical romance, is the Scottish, the like kind of exotic Scottish kilt wearing male
Yes.
and the British female. And all of the British dudes are all foppish and small and weak and just thinking about so I was thinking about that, just more noticing that and the ways in which that functions. So it's like, this is a model for Christian masculinity. Here, this is historical romance, which is like not supposed to necessarily be the model for maybe Christian female spirituality, but although it's like forbidden, but also, something that clearly gets read and watched.
Sure.
Just as a side note. But the other thing I was thinking about a lot throughout hearing you talk is that connection piece between the identification, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, identification of Scottish people and that legacy of trauma of the Scottish immigrant to the United States who lived under oppressive rule in Scotland, and who lost identity in people and, largely settled in Appalachia, other areas, in the United States, that connection thread with our own national identity and valuation, our historical stories and mythologies around freedom and the fight against colonial rule from England, right? And how that thread then becomes, and you even think of Hamilton, which is like it's really racially diverse. And my spouse and I got in a disagreement because he loves Hamilton. I appreciate Hamilton. And I'm like, Hamilton's also very sexist. Like there's a lot of stuff going on here, and how the king, right? He's of course queerified, like, oh me, oh my, like I'm the king of England, and that even. So those legacies of how those then get enshrined in the lost cause of Southern, the war of Southern aggression, how, and just these connections between the sense of who then, as we think about today, this is a long way to say, like the ways that these connections get made to tell a particular story of a people who are looking for identity and meaning, and how we make sense of all this. And then what is the call, which is that article you referenced. It's a great piece in the, what's the call to be Christian? Like it's, like you're saying, not to nationhood or to these sorts of things, but what does it mean to be shaped by Jesus and that call? So I don't know, I know I just threw a lot the second part of what I said, but just that those threads of the way that these mythologized histories and how the different threads of Scottish immigration trauma, our own story of what it means to be Americans, the story of the lost war for the Southerners looking for identity, and how then today we keep going back to these stories to resurrect a particular vision of whiteness even that makes us feel safe.
Yeah.
Or,
And there
I don't know.
is,
I don't know, I'm just thinking about it.
I mean, it goes back to one of the things that I think about why, even Wild at Heart was so sort of wildly successful, which is that the one thing that I think Eldridge got right was noticing that sense of lack of identity, and noticing that there was such a void there, and locating that void of identity among this particular demographic of people, American Christian men. And he talks about that very poignantly. And that's incredibly powerful, because I think that's what makes a lot of people really identify with that book. It's the one part of the book that I identify with, for that matter. And so he's got his finger so powerfully on this absence, right? And when you point so powerfully to an absence and get people to feel that absence in such powerful ways, then automatically what you're going to do is open the floodgates for anything that can fill that absence to come flooding in. And the easiest things are going to be the ones that come flooding in the most quickly. And all of the stories that you mentioned, all of the underdog stories, all of the, little guy against the foppish elites, the masculine peasant against the foppish elites, all that kind of thing. And that's one of those stories we tell ourselves over and over again that way. But it's the sense of that absence at the core that drives that and gives it so much energy. Is that sort of speaking to your question?
It's more a wonder, yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that the mentality that Trump appealed to? He identified that same kind of
Yeah.
to feel a void. Isn't that
Yeah, well, it's the again in Make America Great Again.
people were working with him,
Yeah.
saw that mindset.
I agree that the need for real grappling with male identity is very important. I think we've been through an age of women grappling with their identity, and I think men have to do the same thing. But I am concerned, as you indicate, that you open the floodgate and what comes in, and I see an anger infected culture. And I've tried to understand, why are people so angry, and especially Christians so angry, marching against mask mandates, airplane violence, Charlottesville, January 6th, school board meetings. It's just rampant. And I see from what you've shared with us tonight that one of the important influencers, especially in the Christian community, is this kind of twisting of that whole effort to come to really grapple with the whole issue of male identity. And it scares me. I'll tell you, it scares me.
I just realized, I mean, when you're sharing your paper, I kept being like, oh my gosh, like the legacy of this, like this book has profoundly shaped the evangelical church. Like,
well, it couldn't miss. I mean, there was
was
a copy
fodder
in
there, right?
Every set of hands, and that feeling was so strong.
Yeah.
And it still is.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why I think the book sort of maintains a lot of currency.
But even though it's not at its height of popularity right now,
not like it was.
it was,
Well, Amazon seems to think it's pretty popular.
Is it being used in in
Yeah,
higher ed?
I guess so.
academia, as a tech, you aren't, but in some of the noted evangelical colleges.
That I don't know. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
It's just shaped us. I mean,
And I guess it's interesting. I was just thinking about, because I graduated from college in '93, and I missed this book. Like it didn't like, and I guess I didn't really have that identity necessarily as an evangelical either. I wound up in an evangelical institution for a while. And I would say, because I started at Bethel in '05, that there were classes, but they were not, they would not have been considered sort of academic heavyweight classes. They would be more like like some of the seminar that like the president hosted or something, Yeah. Or they would be like a lower level. And at one point there was someone who tried to bring those books into a class on gender in the Bible department. And we helped him to find the door in the department, because we were like, you're not going to use this in the way that you're intending to use it. As opposed to
unironically, as
right,
not
right, or at
just
least
as
that was the way.
something to study in a cultural way. But
Right, that
something
seemed that was
to-
sort of
yeah.
that seemed to be, it was more prescriptive as opposed to like,
Let's look at this as a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah. But that's the only example I can think of.
It's number one on.
Elaine, is it number one? She said there's only one book left, I think.
There is only one book left, and there are 4,500 ratings, 94% of which are high ratings. I could go back and see how recent those ratings are, but I would imagine they're relatively recent.
Well, Mark, I think I'm going to hand it over to Sarah because she's going to make a concluding comment. But thank you so much. We were obviously
once again geeking out like this is a privilege for me.
We were obviously a small and intimate company, but and we went into something that was like, from a certain perspective, esoteric or geeky, like you said, but clearly has deep resonance with current political, social, cultural, and religious dynamics. There's no way to get around it. So we really appreciate you coming in and speaking. And it's great to see you again. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and friend, Sarah.
Yep. Well, two things. Oh, should I come up there? Okay. Oh, I think two things then. One is that I'd like to give a shout out to my spouse who has embodied the inner journey of like getting in touch with his own emotions and his own, there was that sense of absolute lack. He also knew and felt and searching for identity. But I'm grateful for everyone who continues to lean in to do that inner work, to really seek of what does it mean to follow Jesus of Nazareth and be able to be a whole person. And to be able to care for the widow, the foreigner, the oppressed, to be able to speak truth to power, to be able to stand firm in one's convictions, to do so without the need to cut off ears and things like that. And I'm interspersing imageries from Bible and other things. So thanks just for sharing so much. Really appreciate the thoughtful work that you've done. Next month, on the third Thursday, we will be hosting another faith and forum. This will be one of our faith and justice forums. And we, in a lot of our faith and justice work, have really been focusing a lot on conversations related to race, racism, housing, et cetera, particularly along the lines of analysis of white and Black and white supremacy, exploring what it means to be people of faith in that sort of space. And in November, we're going to move to a conversation around what does it mean to think about justice in terms of the conversation about Native persons in the Americas. And we're going to be exploring a book together. It's called Native. It's on identity, belonging, and rediscovering God by Caitlin B. Curtis. We have copies that are here. in the reception desk. They will also be in the connection corner, and they're available. Caitlin Curtis is a Christian Native woman and really wrestles with all of these different intersections, and I think offers invitation, challenge, etc. And particularly as we're in November and looking towards Thanksgiving and all these contested stories about what is Thanksgiving, what does it mean to be a people who are grateful, etc. We thought this would be something we'd want to explore together. So same time, same channel, month forward, basically that third November 18th. Thank you. Let me pray as we close our time together. Loving God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks that you came in flesh in Christ, and that in that embodiedness, I think you're pointing to all of us, whatever our gender, of a way to be human, a way to be Christian, a way to be people, where we're invited not to live according to the machinations of the search for power in flesh. For even as the prophet reminds us, it's not by power, by might, but by your spirit. So may we be a people who are characterized once again, even more deeply by the call to follow Jesus of Nazareth, to seek after the fruits of the Spirit, to be a people who embody the call to live the Beatitudes, a people who are shaped by you. Give us wisdom and courage and discernment about what that means to live that in our culture and our times, to wrestle together and continue to do so with the ways in which we reflect upon critically and thoughtfully the ways in which our culture and all these other narratives shape us, that we might indeed be your people, live as the body of Christ, and bring your love and your healing and your good news to this world. It's in your name that we go forth. Amen.
Okay.